sorting, more sorting. To the open space team, and she's an archivist, and she knows a lot about archiving. And we had a kind of informal conversation the other day, and I thought it'd be really great to just take a few minutes to listen to her. So, Kim.
Hello.
Hi. I want to just ask you, as we touched on the other day, since this project is all about sorting, how archivists, at least archivists in the Western world, decided they would sort with some kind of, I like to think of it as an imagined neutrality, and you use the term neutrality with tongue-in-cheek at yourself. So why don't you talk about that a bit?
I think a lot of the original archival theory looks at the idea of that you do not impose anything onto the records. In a perfect archival world, you receive the records from a creator, they are in a perfect order, and thus you don't need to sort them because they make sense. It is clear archives want to reflect, they would like the archives to reflect the functions and the activities of the creator. And so in a perfect world that does not exist, you receive the records, they are perfectly organized, they reflect the activities of the creator, there are no gaps, everything's represented, and thus you don't need to sort them.
Okay, but what happens when you don't get stuff like that?
Well, you never get stuff like that.
Right.
You want to, then it becomes something that archivists can be, I think, uncomfortable talking about, where you impose order. So now it's more common to be more upfront about the fact that you are imposing order. So in finding aids, archivists will say, like, we received these records in a way that was unintelligible to us. We have imposed a physical order based on what we perceive the functions and activities to be. Or what can be common is you don't change the order of anything in the boxes that you receive, but you do, when creating the finding aid, create an intellectual order.
Oh, okay.
So you say, these are files that we feel are related to the function of fundraising, and these are files that we feel are related to the function of administration, but they're still kept in the boxes.
Okay.
So you are imposing an order because in the end, the hope is that the archive will reflect how the creator or creating body worked and operated, if that makes...
It does make sense. It immediately poses potential problems if the person is still alive, or even in the case of descendants.
Yes.
Oh, my uncle, my grandmother wasn't like that, and so how do those issues get resolved? You said something to me that in the initial idea of archiving, you couldn't add or subtract. What was there was what was there. But it seems like in the world we live in now, and possibly before as well, things you learn that so-and-so was not such a lovely person as you thought, that the guy was a domestic abuser. I mean, there's stuff that needs to contextualize what's already there, but you can't just add it like that. It's not Wikipedia.
No, and it's interesting. You can do accruals, but normally they would only accept those if they're coming from the creating body or like descendants. So in the case of an individual, family members being like, oh, we found some photos that our grandma used to have, and that you can bring those in and that. But I think it would be seen as mixing, they're called fawns, which is like the organic record of a person, to include other people's records. And that, so if someone else has an experience with a person in which they were an abuser or a positive influence or whatever, anything like that, the hope would be that you could maybe link the fawns. So you could say, like, this person is related to this person who has their own archive, or is related to working with this government or this business that did certain actions, so that you aren't intermixing the files themselves.
Yet you would be able to easily see that contextual material.
Yeah, that's with digital stuff, there's a lot of opportunities that I think archivists are trying to figure out to create sort of relational entities and expand context, because that's something that the view of how archives can only have a single creator is very limiting. And that for research and what people want to research, and it affects the way we name things too. So like, I have a friend who is does language research work at the Smithsonian.
Okay.
And what she talks about is all of the journals are named after the researcher. There was a researcher who worked with her nation. And so none of them talk about the content of what's in there. They're named like Dr. Smith's journal number 2, Dr. Smith's journal number 3. That means she has to read every journal to find any time he wrote, instead of making it content based, because the archive is so focused on the creator.
Okay.
And that. So yeah.
Do you think sites like Wikipedia, which are more, I won't call them open source because that's not really true, but there's an ability for people to adjust things. Do they influence archiving? Or is archiving still conservative? Pardon the pun.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think it's interesting. I'm endings. I think a biographical sketch, but the focus is still on the records themselves and describing what is there.
The things you touched on the other day, which I also found useful, was the idea of alternative archives. And this all kinds of groups that sometimes are called marginal, I don't know, artistic activity, which is generally not the center of our society. So maybe you could riff on that a little bit. Let me ask you this. What's an alternative archive, Kim?
Oh, an alternative archive is something, they're often considered community archives, where it is usually groups of people who share a common identity or experience deciding that their voices and their experiences are not valued by mainstream institutional archives, and so thus they are going to create their own archive in which people can see themselves and see the history of their community and feel belonging. They're not controversial to me, but they can be controversial because they can be seen as sort of artificial in that they are actively calling out and asking people to give, instead of having someone be like, oh, I want to give this now because I'm received. And it provides a sense of belonging that I think can be lacking. There are tons of gaps, purposefully, there are tons of gaps in a lot of archival records, and archives inform individual and cultural and national memory.
Are not kept in proper, I was going to say repair, that you probably know the better word than I do, but they're not kept properly, so they deteriorate over time, and or the person who's looking after them passes away or is unable to look after them. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, because on the one hand, you want what you just described, and you want people to control the meaning of their own history and the history of whatever group they're part of. But you also don't, or is there a resolution of that?
There are a couple of things that have been done. There are times when community archives grow to a scale where they cannot, or for some reason they cannot sustain the level of care. And so they will work with institutions, usually universities and special collections, to donate stuff, which can, depending on how flexible the university is willing to be, can be very beneficial. But it can be also, some people don't like that idea because you are giving up a lot of control and sometimes universities or any institutional archive have rules that don't align about, universities have rules about who can come in, or have grants and receive funding that hopefully can help them if they have a solid volunteer base. All of those things are helpful, but sometimes I think you do see community archives kind of naturally wither and pass, and I think some of them wither and pass because that's the intention, and that if it's the passion project of one person and no one else has felt the need to continue it, that can naturally, but I don't know, I think it's a lot of volunteer labor, and that I feel like often you have the same thing, I think, for very small towns and their archives. It is reliant on these volunteers and people who don't have professional training, but who have the level of care that people with professional training sometimes don't have, to preserve and keep them available. And that,
What was the, again, I've already forgotten.
Oh,
you reminded me.
Post-custodialism. Yes, sorry.
It's me that should be. I can't. So what is post-custodialism?
It's an approach that some archives are trying, in which places, community archives or any sort of group or person can approach an archive and say, I have these things, I think they're really important.
Let's use an example. Oh, right.
So it's the idea that the end goal of an archival and sort of donor relation is not that everything ends up at the archive.
Right.
And it can maybe this community or an individual, but the goal is not that you get full ownership over them, but that you are holding them until the place is ready to accept them or has the space or the ability to. And yeah, it's this idea, I think archives and archivists, sometimes feel an ownership over the items and that they need all of them, an all-encompassing sort of the archive, that the goal of the archive justifies any means. And the post-custodialism kind of pushes against that and looks at how archives can use some of their funding and institutional power to support instead of just taking.
This is going on, as you know, in many institutions, not just archives, the idea of sharing resources. Sometimes it's very intentional and works well. Other times communities have to drag the resources out and say, and institutions fear, well, on the one hand, they like it because they can be seen to be doing things in community and supporting folks they might not otherwise, but they lose control.
They lose control. And I think we talked about yesterday, for archives especially, you become more accountable in a way that I think archivists consciously or subconsciously can fear, because when you position yourself as a Jenkinson would position an archivist as
whoa, who's Jenkinson?
No,
you can't just throw that out. Who was she?
You know, as Hilary Jenkinson, who wrote the English manual and was like the founding father of English archives, would say, as a neutral guardian, then you can't get mad at the archivist because they aren't influencing the archive.
Which is not true.
Which is not true, but if you say it enough, people believe it. And so with these like calls to do things, take more post-custodial approaches, to be more open about the influence archivists do have, you become more accountable, even in small ways, like when you create a finding aid, putting your name on it and saying, I created this finding aid, and that, or even admitting, I imposed an intellectual order, because then if people don't like the intellectual order,
they know who did it.
They know, I mean, they don't have your contact info, but they know this is not. So I think on a personal level that is fearful, and I think, there's a kind of a sense that if archivists admit that they do things that are not neutral and that archives isn't a science, that it will be devalued as a field and as a study.
That's interesting.
Because there is like...
So if you get too community-based, you're not scientific anymore.
Yes, well, and if archives is a science at all, there are people who will only refer to archive programs as archival science, and people who refuse to and only call it archival studies, and that because
it's not a science.
I don't think it's a science.
No, because they don't believe it.
They don't think it's a science. They don't think it's empirical enough, and that there are earlier...
It's not, really.
No, there are some people that, it's interesting, there are some theorists, Theodore Schellenberg in the States, who believed that, I think it was Schellenberg, maybe it's not. Anyway, there are people who talk about the idea that you can that archives provide history an empirical basis, that you can do history empirically by basing it on the most documents possible, and that kind of influenced it. But I think today most people going through the archival field would push back against maybe not the term archival science, but the idea that embedded in that is this like neutral rationality.
Well, that's the idea of science, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I have another guest coming, but I want to ask you one question before you go. Given what I'm doing here in sorting, I'll try to ask the question briefly, which I'm not all that good at. What advice would you give me as an artist in terms of the archive that I want to achieve before I die?
I think it would be interesting. I think thinking about it already is good. I think that thinking about it, and I don't think there's any shame in sort of self-editing on that, but also being aware that the archive, once or if you pass,
I will.
You can.
I will. It's okay. Doesn't hurt me for you to say that.
you can't control how it will be activated
No.
by other people.
No.
So as much as you put into making yourself seem like you always made your bed or whatever, the way the archive is activated is beyond even the archivist's control. There's your interpretation of your archive, there's the archivist's
And then what happens
interpretation,
later.
and then there is how people
I already
look
see
at
that
it.
even as I'm alive, that people interpret not just my work, but things I've written, and I go, whoa, that's not,
Yeah.
the way it is.
And if you are wanting, like, if the end goal of this, or the end of this project, you do want to sort of look at donating stuff or whatever, I feel like don't be afraid to advocate and see and push things and see,
For myself.
yes,
Yeah.
can we make things so that, like, if you end up talking to a university or an institution, they want your stuff, and if you have desires for it, I
Make
think
them known.
yeah, exactly. I think sometimes people can be intimidated by archives
Yeah.
because they don't know.
I'm not intimidated.
Good, exactly. I'm not
And
concerned about it.
I always believe in making your desires known in every phase of life.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Kate.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
I'll head on out.
Okay.
Yay.
Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, of course. Here.
Next, number 42, please. This is my friend and colleague and the curator of whatever it is this sorting is about. He's also a curator and artist himself, and he's the executive director of Open Space. Say hi, Doug Jarvis.
Hi, Doug Jarvis.
So, why are we so far behind? Oh well, doesn't really matter as long as it's getting recorded. So,
How's it going?
so probably I'm thinking about, like, what do I want to talk to Doug about? Maybe other than France, my partner, you're probably the person that I've spoken the most to about this. And it's gone on for a few years now, as you know. And so, what are you thinking about it? Not so much, as the executive director of an art space, but as a curator, is this process still got some value to it? Or does it seem like, like many people that come by the window, what the F is this, What is this dude doing?
Yeah, no, it's a good broad question for kind of coming into the space in this recorded capacity. I don't know. It's interesting. I don't really know where to start in particular, other than we've been talking about this for a while. We've been talking about this long enough that our talking has contributed to the piles of stuff
absolutely true,
to
yeah.
sort through,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which I think
Partly
is
what I'm trying to do right now.
yeah, which I think is an interesting part of, what we could conveniently say maybe when we started talking about, it's like, oh, you've got a certain amount of stuff, things seem kind of finite, you got to figure it out. How do you, as an artist, hitting a certain stage or maturing into a certain stage in your practice as an artist working in Canada, what does that mean, and what do these records kind of have opportunity to work with, show, play with? It's kind of pretty open, right? And the things kind of keep coming, or
They keep
or
opening,
Yeah,
is the way I
the
would say it.
possibilities.
Yeah.
As with anything, the more we talk about it, the more we can kind of parse it out and make more to play with, or make more to think about. I think my interest is how, hanging around, because sometimes I sit out front in my outdoor office,
What
and
he's,
I can hear
what he's
portions
talking
of it.
about is like this. You'll sit outside there, and that's the street. There's the bus stop that I've referred to before. And sometimes Doug sits out there and just listens. If it's not pouring rain in Victoria.
Or I'm out there working on other stuff and
Right.
just observing, right? I think it brings up, it brings up all kinds of stuff. I hear bits and pieces. I think it, in a way, it's like everybody, you're holding on to like a certain kind of thread, the sorting kind of thread. And I hear you saying to people, we all sort things, and asking people, sorting different areas of their life, or different kind of, bodies of knowledge or things. And, so it's making me think logistically, or, what does sorting mean? Sorting can also just be processing. And so I'm hearing different things. other folks are bringing up like Kim talking about the theories of archiving, which is super interesting.
Yeah.
I was talking with them earlier about, and this bringing this project into that whole world
Yeah.
of who keeps what and why, and
Yeah.
the protocols that go with that. I'd say so the people you're meeting with, the kind of the discussion locally around the gallery in that way is interesting, because it's, you're activating the window, you're moving through materials, you're asking questions, you're kind of provoking thoughts of people. That's all kind of one thing. Yeah, the organization itself, we're working with our own
Yeah.
memory and archives, and
Actually, she was using the fact that Open Space, which is the space we're in here, has donated at least part of their archives to the university. And you could say that the Open Space Archive was a quotations community archive or alternative archive. And now it's been brought into an institution which gives it credibility. It'll be looked after properly. There's lots of advantages, but there's a loss of control. Do you feel like there's a loss of control over the meaning of open space because it's now at the University of Victoria?
No. I think it's a convenient question to ask me, but I don't think.
Well, I'm not trying to get you to speak against
I know.
UVic.
But I don't. I know what you're kind of asking
Yeah.
there. It's kind of like, do we lose agency with
Yeah.
parts of our memory? So there, I would say a little bit, sure,
Okay.
right? But at the same time, you're kind of going through a process yourself. We can all keep all these things all the time, and there's a comfort of going, oh, I've got all my things, right? But all of those things aren't mine.
Is it a good word?
Yeah, but all of those things in the open space
No,
archives,
sure.
you said the community archive, they're not mine. We're
Right.
kind of
No,
custodians.
that's
in
fair,
a
but
way.
you are the main custodian.
Yeah,
If
but-
you said, see these boxes here, throw them all out.
Yeah, but I don't want to empower my role
Yeah.
as you kind of are in that way of, oh, I can make decisions that do that. Sure, of course, certain roles can have agency, but I think there's an aspect of we're doing something with it that, yes, it puts it into another institution so that culturally it can kind of be cared for, because it is a collective community memory, right? So I don't want to go all of a sudden have a turn kind of, oh, we worked with Chris, it kind of didn't really go anywhere, so you know what, archives don't mean anything anymore,
Yeah.
let's just get rid of them.
No, of course
right?
not.
So
No.
we wouldn't do that,
Yeah.
right? So this idea of having control, having agency over our own stuff, sure, it's a different relationship with it, and yes, I've worked with those archives quite a bit,
Are you allowed to add or subtract from them once they're in? Like
those
if-
specific histories, I don't
Yeah.
know, those are good
Okay.
questions. I think, again, the questions you're asking me, and this is stuff, we've been talking about this for a long time, so it's not like just all of a
No,
sudden I've
no,
met
no,
you and
no,
I'm like,
no.
hold on a second. I'm
No,
hearing
but-
levels of questions,
Yeah.
and you're doing your interview as part of your podcast here, and I'm stepping into it. So just to say, there's a lot to think about. I think it prompts relationships between institutions. It prompts changing what an archive or what, care over an archive or who has, it's an opportunity to build those, to change those relationships, to challenge them maybe. Again, talking with Kim, she was talking about a certain, historical notion of what archiving is, and any artist I've worked with or any artist archive has always been somewhat challenging to that. So your project in itself is, a collection, but it's also always already a challenge to what an archive can be, right? Like in that way. So I think we retain the agency to be artists and to treat our memories, our histories as we, want to. So this idea that we are unwittingly giving them over to the powerful institutions of somewhere else, I don't really believe that.
Yeah, me neither.
Right? So I think that, just to
Yeah.
kind
I
of
didn't
back
mean
it
to
up in
imply
that way,
with
it's
my
like,
question. I didn't mean to say the evil, University of Victoria and the fantastic. I just wanted to sort of look at that relationship and actually to put that relationship in positive context. Institutions throughout Western world, and perhaps in the rest of the world, which I'm not as knowledgeable about, are trying to figure out what their meaning is. So we're talking about universities, museums, the classroom, all kinds of institutions, even funding agencies, if we're talking about cultural funding, are constantly in the world we live in now trying to figure out. I was recently at a conference where people were bemoaning the fact, it was a theater conference, that a lot of theaters remain empty all the time. What are we to do with these buildings and so on and so forth? So one of the ways that they can become more relevant following the kind of the methodologies, if you let me use that word, of the new museology is to make them more like places where people feel welcome. And one of the things that Kim just talked about, in addition to that, was taking the resources they have, which are quite large usually, and sharing them with communities. So by taking the Open Space Archive, they're actually doing kind of community outreach. I don't really like that word outreach, but they're involving themselves with the community in a way that they're, in a small way at least, I don't want to overstate it, sharing their resources with the community. So there is a positive spin to it. It isn't all. I hate binaries, as you know. I don't like the idea that there's evil institutions and then, unwitting, as you used the good word there a minute ago. It's always a negotiation, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. But we are part of the same arts ecology.
Yeah, we are.
I think,
Yeah.
I see value in the fact that we can, first of all, there is an archive to, pass along or share in that way. There are some practical aspects of it, as we know, with the elevator and upgrading. And, I don't know. I don't want to say that there aren't other options or other paths that, an organization could take, but I think the way that open space is a part of where we are, it doesn't, those documents are there now, and they're a portion of the memory, right? Like, I think it's interesting when we think of, we can think of all memories the same, but it's not. We've got all these different parts and bits and pieces, and, the things are technically cared for there. Can we add to them? I don't know. I don't know if that's the important thing at the moment. I'm sure if things came about that were like, oh, we found another box that aligns with exactly, well, then that might be, and it gets added in that way. To say, oh, Chris actually has his own documents from that time, and now we want to add them into. I don't think they would say, oh yeah, okay, we'll just slot them right in. I think that becomes an associated collection.
That's what Kim talked about.
And we both know Bill Bartlett and the slow scan kind of history, and there's lots of documents that have been generated since from that, and so that's an association to the historical kind of documents. So I don't know. I don't. That's why when you're asking me these questions, I don't want to answer them specifically because I think they're kind of like, yeah, sure, I could answer that, but I don't. I think there's lots more possibilities about what we're doing and what this project is doing, and that's maybe where, I sat down and you've asked me what I'm thinking because you're already mid-stride of talking, but I am a little bit more interested in what you're getting out of this because, again, we've talked a lot about you having a bunch of stuff, and how is that stuff related to your identity as an artist? Mm-hmm. How is it related to what art can be, could be, could still be? What, how the objects have sentiment or have meaning? There's all so many things tied into it. It's not just an easy kind of answer.
No,
it's a whole array of things.
The way you're thinking right now is exactly where I was going to be my next question. Because, if we say it started, as you correctly point out, with, I've got a bunch of stuff, Doug, and I have to figure out how to sort through it and see what's art and what's not and what archive I can create. And then from that, a lot of other questions arose. And part of the reason why that became useful is because it could be used, sorting could be used in something larger than the art world, so that everyone could relate to it. And I've had conversations with absolute strangers who are not sophisticated about art or art history, who are not really even interested in going in, even though I encourage everybody to go in, but they're interested in the idea of sorting. That's the thing that grabs them. So to that end, maybe we'll stop that larger picture and all the associated conversations and bring the idea of sorting back into the art world. Because, open space is an arts society. On two levels. One, on the level of the art archive and what does that actually mean, but also sorting, as I discussed yesterday with two curators, that art is constant. The distribution and presentation of art, regardless of the medium, involves a kind of sorting. And that's historically based on, I don't know what, something called excellence or whatever, but that's changing now. You were at an opening yesterday where I was at the AGGV, and I don't think the curator was thinking in terms of excellence. Maybe she was thinking in terms of relevance, and I don't know, people use different criteria. So I guess my question is, how do we take the big concept of sorting, reduce it, deliberately reduce it in the way you reduce a sauce to its essence, and how it comes into art practice? I mean, I'll ask a provocative question. Do you think everybody's an artist?
Well, I think your kind of analogy of making the sauce or reducing something, to me that thickens it.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't necessarily reduce it, like it's called a reduction, but it thickens it in terms of, you know, what's there. Like it strengthens the flavor in a way. It makes it less liquid, and I think that's kind of maybe more the way I'm thinking of this. It's connected to stuff. I don't know.
Is that thickening, is that the part that remains art?
Well, again, the art part of it, what I'm interested in is how, you know, we've talked about this, how meaning is made, right?
Yeah.
And how people have engagements with stuff. And, you know, we deal with, you know, even through our own practices and through the projects that we engage with in collaborations, and like people are out there living in the world, and, you know, different things are floating around. The art question, you know, is certainly, as you're saying, is kind of provocative in that way, but I'm interested in what catches people's attention, how the possibilities that certain ways that something can be presented, or that, you know, like you've got objects out here in the desk, just the idea of sorting out these objects, the jars and the COVID tests and the little notes, like that, there's an intentionality there that's taken something that was otherwise, you know, they have aesthetic values in and of themselves, the colors and the
But generally
shapes.
stuff that would be thrown away.
Yeah, but you have technically sorted them into a row, right? Literally, and it can now become something visual that looks intentional. So I'm interested in how people who have creative tendencies or imaginations can work with materials and ideas and all types of things and make, you know, things and put things out into the world as possibilities. How other people respond to them and how they impact them or influence them or show how the world can be, you know, I'm totally kind of curious how some people walk by and go, oh, those Marmite jars. Like, you know, Marmite it's a specific kind of symbol,
it is,
right?
yeah.
And either people know it or they don't, but if they know it, they're like, oh, it's like you can almost taste it, right?
One person actually asked me if I was opening a Marmite store.
There you go, right? So, but that's an interesting possibility to intersect in their time walking down the street. To all of a sudden be going, oh my God, what happened today? What happened? You know, maybe they're tourists, maybe they're just around. Like, oh, what did you see? Oh, I saw Marmite jars, and I wondered, are they opening a Marmite store down on 4th Street? And you think, well, that's kind of okay. Well, that's seemingly random, but also okay, that's kind of interesting, right? To me, that's the possibilities that encounters with stuff that people have put together in many ways or different ways is what is interesting, right? Whether, you know, there's the umbrella of art that we're kind of housed in, and there's a lot of, you know, bureaucracy and industry and whatever that helps keep that going, and I'm very aware of that. You know, you and I talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, but in some ways that's the housing, right? It's we do all of that administrative and other work to make these spaces where somebody can come by and go, okay, is it super profound? Maybe for some people not so much, but it's enough to kind of go, oh no, those things are important.
Or even walk up the stairs. And
Or exactly, it's a draw in,
Yeah.
or it's just enough that it's like, oh no, it's a part of something more, right? Is it like there's the full kind of center as we're trying to develop in that way, and having this window space is definitely part of that. So that's another layer of in the space and this project that you're doing and the process that you're engaging with and the research residency kind of aspect of that. You know, it's all like set up, you know, it seems like it's been going well in that way. You know, the bigger question of how art it is, I would rather talk about all the things that intersect, you know, and not really necessarily declare something, because it's not.
My point there was not to make you be, you know, the art critic that decides the Marmite jars art, but the COVID tests are not. That's not where I was coming from. I was coming from two places, and you've already kind of suggested one. One was the taking of the idea of sorting, the concept of sorting, the doing of sorting, if you will, that is part and parcel of all artistic practice, whether people see it as the word sorting. Some people would say selecting, some people, a sculptor would say, well, you know, I'm just removing the stuff to allow the piece to speak to me. A playwright might say, well, I had 16 characters, but now I've only got 4. So there is a process of sorting. That's one. The other is the very thing you just alluded to, what gets sorted into art and what doesn't. When you were speaking, it made me think of these kind of allied creative practices, like fashion, like interior decorating. You know, when you were talking about people, I asked you if you think everybody's an artist, and you talked about how people create. But we somehow still keep the boundaries that interior decoration is not art. So you walk into someone's house, it's beautiful, it's got an aesthetic, or it's not beautiful deliberately, but is their living room art? So I'm not trying to get you or me to police the boundaries of art, or, you know, okay, Doug, I need a definitive answer right now. What is art and what is not? But I am interested, as I know you are, in how art both is influenced by everyday life and then pours itself back into everyday life. And that seems to be among contemporary artists, especially contemporary